Welcome everybody here today. This is our History Calling, Where Will It Take You series, and really happy to have everybody here and happy to join us. So why don't we just turn the time to you, Jeremy, and why don't you tell us kind of what what you do and who you are, and we'll get things rolling.
Sure. Well, thank you, Arnie, and for the invitation, and thanks to everyone for joining us this morning. So as Arnie said, I am Jeremy Johnston. I work at the Buffalo Bills Center of the West. My current position here is historian and the managing editor of the papers William F. Cody. So as historian, I'm tasked with generating content for exhibitions, displays, publications, and then through the papers William F. Cody, I oversee a project to collect all the known writings by William F. Cody, a lot of correspondence which is scattered all over the United States and overseas. We also managed to print a publication series, one through the University of Nebraska Press and one through the University of Oklahoma Press. So in addition to collecting the primary resources, we're also facilitating new scholarship related to the life and legacy of Buffalo Bill Cody. So, and then just a few months ago, I was also serving as the curator of the Buffalo Bill Museum. And I've now shifted that role onto somebody else. So, that took away a lot of my headaches, but don't tell the person that was appointed that. So
we didn't invite them today.
I think the walls here at the center are pretty thin though, so I hope he doesn't hear.
Well, that's great. You mentioned a couple of publications. What are the names of those publications? If you know, I'm sure we've got folks that would like to look into those.
Sure. So the University of Nebraska series, this is a reprint series. So Frank Christensen, who works there at Brigham Young University, edited 2 volumes. One is The Wild West in Europe, and the other is the autobiography of the Honorable William F. Cody. And I worked with Lynn House, who's a historian here, to publish George Beck's memoirs. George Beck was Cody's partner when they founded the town of Cody and set up the reclamation system here, the Cody Canal, which brought settlers in, which is kind of an interesting perspective. George Beck's perspective is interesting on just how the West was developed. Beck really used Cody to promote this area, which if you ever seen a photo of Cody, Wyoming in the early 1900s, you often wonder who in the world would want to settle here. Well, Buffalo Bill convinced them they needed to settle here, including some of my family. So anyway, that's the reprint series. There's a couple other volumes in there by Chris Dixon. And then a series we launched a few years ago with the University of Oklahoma Press as a monograph series. And this looks at the culture and history of the West in the vein of popular entertainment. So a lot of our volumes are focused on William F. Cody. For example, we just published a book by Michelle Delaney that looks at the poster art, the marketing of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And it's a beautiful coffee table book with all sorts of full color illustrations of these bright, brilliant posters marketing the Wild West. We've done a book on the Buffalo Bills connections to the development of filming Westerns, Lakota performers, their art and artwork that was generated through performing in Wild West shows, biography of John Burke, Lillian Russell, and just anyway, so it's been great working with younger scholars who have looked at these different aspects of Buffalo Bill's life and legacy. And then I'm currently working on a book for that series that looks at the partnership between Theodore Roosevelt and Buffalo Bill Cody.
Yeah, we read about that. Now, I think that's just amazingly interesting, is to get the depth that you're able to do there. Tell us, Jeremy, how did you get to where you are? You know, what's your story? How did you get to be where you are?
Well, I'll give you the log cabin version. So my family were some of those individuals lured to Cody, Wyoming by Buffalo Bill. So on my dad's side of the family, they settled here in the Cody region in the late 1890s. One of my ancestors was also a hunting guide for Theodore Roosevelt in Colorado, and then he migrated to Wyoming, worked as a game warden in Yellowstone, and then migrated here to Cody. And then on my mom's side of the family, they homesteaded in the Powell, Wyoming area under the Federal Reclamation Project, the Shoshone Project. I was very fortunate to grow up with both sets of grandparents in the same town, two great grandmothers, a great grandfather, and everywhere we went was really for me a history lesson. And I really discovered that the relevancy of history, because when I had questions about why do we do the things we do here in Wyoming, why do we act this way, why are certain lands open, certain lands forbidden, everything, I soon discovered that history really gave me the answers. It really demonstrated who we are and how we act and how our culture has been generated. So I had this personal interest in history as far back as I can remember. And then I didn't really think I had an opportunity to turn it into a career until I went into high school. And I had some really good history teachers, starting out with Gene Leonard, who was my high school history teacher. And they really persuaded me to look at a career in history. I wasn't exactly sure what that was going to be. At first, I thought it would be teaching at a high school or teaching at a college, or public history. And I kind of bounced back and forth. When I went to the University of Wyoming, I did my best to try and participate in as many internships as I possibly could. So I worked at the Wyoming State Museum, the Wyoming State Archives, the American Heritage Center there at the University of Wyoming, which not only was it a great experience for me, but it also led to some part-time jobs, which gave me a little bit of money to get through college, at least pay for one or two textbooks. So, but anyway, I realized, there's a great opportunity there in history, which was great because I was able to take my passion and put it into my profession. And all my family members thought I was crazy and thought they would be supporting me for the rest of my life, but it all worked out. So I left the University of Wyoming, started teaching at Northwest College in Powell, Wyoming, my hometown where I was born. And actually I was the third generation of my family to teach there, and I taught history. And it was a community college, but for me, it was a great experience because I tell you what, you think you know your subject until you really have to explain it to freshmen and sophomore students. And then you pepper in non-traditional students in on top of that. You're dealing with very different audiences and you're trying to explain things, and it really gets you thinking about your subject. Not only what you know, but how do you convey that to other people? So I was at Northwest for 15 years. And then about 10 years ago, I shifted to the managing editor of the paper's William F. Cody, the job I still keep. And then I was curator for a few years of the Buffalo Bill Museum. And then just a few months ago, was appointed to be the historian of the Center of the West.
That's a great history, and I think it shows our students that there is a path to get to where you want to be, and yours is close. And my goodness, I mean, you lived with history. If you've got grandparents and great grandparents that were right there with you. Mm-hmm. Tell us, Jeremy, tell us about your environment. Tell us about where you're working and what it's like where you're working.
Well, this is my office behind me, and I will explain that I am currently in the process of moving to another office. So, and I'm going to use that as an excuse that my office doesn't usually look this way. Unfortunately, it does. But for all purposes for this presentation, it's just because I'm moving. But anyway, I spend a lot of my time on a computer, writing, reviewing, editing. I spend a lot of time, as much time as I can, getting out and researching different collections. With COVID, of course, a lot of that research is now limited to just digital databases. But I've been very fortunate here in Wyoming, working with two great archival repositories, the American Heritage Center down at the University of Wyoming, which I mentioned. And then also here at the center, we have the McCracken Research Library, which has a tremendous collection of books on the history of the American West. Tremendous archival collection on Buffalo Bill Cody. So I just walk down the hallway and I have access to hundreds of Buffalo Bill's letters, programs, posters, you name it. So I like to spend as much time as I can researching. And then what I like to do, since my subject is closely connected to this region, since I live in Cody, Wyoming, the town that was opened up by George Beck and Buffalo Bill, I love to get out into the area. I think that's one thing that we don't really think of when we think of historians doing their work, but I tell you, for me, it's just been really enlightening to get out to these areas, see the communities that were developed by some of these early settlers of the West, archaeological sites, the TE Ranch that Cody opened up is still here. I've been there, and just to get a feel of the area. I think, especially if you're studying the American West, it's just such a great opportunity, because I know here, and I know down at Salt Lake, there's a lot of places like this as well, or throughout Utah. We're seeing a landscape that a lot of these early Paleo-Indian people witnessed, settlers witnessed, and it just gives you a great opportunity to kind of experience the environment that they lived in.
To see that there has been not much change in a lot of that area, that's inspiring, isn't it?
It is, and it's really struck me when I was back east in Massachusetts, and I went to the John Quincy Adams National Park, and went to their birthplaces. And there's a highway that runs right by these homes. That at one time were basically farms, and it's kind of hard to imagine, what it was like growing up if you were a member of the Adams family, with a highway zooming right by your farmhouse.
Well, tell us about projects that you're working on. You have new projects, you have stuff that's coming up. Give us some insight to that, would you?
Sure. So through the papers of WMF Cody, we are working with a lot of younger scholars. We're looking at some proposals now. There's one on Pawnee Bill's Wild West, things like music that was used in the Wild West. We have about 20 potential volumes for a reprint series. It is amazing, a lot of us are familiar with Buffalo Bill, but his legacy in print is really quite striking. So people were writing about him. He wrote a number of his own autobiographies. There were about 3 different versions of his autobiography that he published, in addition to some other material such as a history of the Indian Wars. So what we do with that is we reach out to editors to write introductions, review the annotations. I know there at BYU, under the supervision of Frank Christensen and through the Charles Redd Center, we've had a number of BYU students working on just the beginning editing of some of these manuscripts. And so it's a great opportunity for students to kind of see what it's like, the editorial side of history. Other projects, like I mentioned, I'm trying to finish my one manuscript. I have a biography on Theodore Roosevelt that I'm trying to wrap up for the South Dakota State Historical Society. And then future exhibits here at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. We just wrapped up an exhibition. It'll be coming down. It's been up for 2 years, but it was the history of the Stampede Rodeo here in Cody, Wyoming, which was a lot of fun to work on. In fact, I was able to slip in a few film clips of my grandfather, Johnston, and my uncle Jim riding in the Cody Stampede Parade in the exhibition. But anyway, that'll be coming down, and then we'll be working on a history of Yellowstone, looking at the people, the cultures that were living and residing there and visiting Yellowstone National Park. So anyway, there's always something happening here between the exhibitions, the publication series, and then the digital archive we're working on. We're looking at some revisions there and updating some things. So it's I like to call it job security. So I got a lot to keep me busy and hopefully out of trouble for next 15 years.
Well, that's good. I think maybe that's an interesting piece of history. As you dig, you find more.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing too that I really enjoy is a lot of presentations. So to school groups, to community groups, it's just really great to interact with the community. And not only are you sharing your interpretation of the past, your stories with the audiences, but it's always wonderful to hear their stories and their perspectives. It's great to keep that dialogue between you and the community going.
Well, and I think especially in a community like yours that has been there for so long and have the genealogical reach there, I think that could be very, very interesting as far as what they add to your discussions.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And actually, we're not that old of a community. So, I mean, really, Cody wasn't founded until 1896. Powell wasn't founded until basically incorporated until 1909. So what is great is, we're talking with people who remember when Buffalo Bill was coming through, or telling us stories about their parents meeting Buffalo Bill. And I heard my grandmother, she just passed away a few years ago, but she was telling me all about her stories of going to the Buffalo Bill Museum when it was in the little log cabin across the street and meeting Mary Jester Allen, who was Buffalo Bill's niece. And she would invite them in and serve them tea with a tea set that Buffalo Bill gave her. So, it's just amazing, the past that we're studying here isn't really that old. And it's been wonderful because we've been able to really save some pieces of history that were close to being lost. Two of my greatest discoveries kind of made me feel like Indiana Jones, though I didn't have to go through many traps. But I went to Buffalo, New York, and met an individual by the name of Rumsey. If you've been to Cody, Wyoming, Rumsey Street was named after Bronson Rumsey, was one of the investors. And it just so happened his grandson had a collection of all these business records in his basement. And he brought them out. They were canceled checks, correspondence, ledgers in Buffalo, New York. So I went to, and you talk about traps, Buffalo, New York, in the middle of January, when you get one of those lake effect storms, that is far worse than the Temple of Doom. So, but anyway, we saved those documents and brought them in. The other interesting project, the Beck manuscript that I mentioned, when Lynn House and I first started working on this, we noticed there were two separate manuscripts, one at the Heritage Center and one at the Park County Archives here in Cody. And they were the original manuscripts, but we started looking at them, comparing the two, and they were very different. Different lengths, different content, and we were kind of going, what's going on here? So we managed to make contact with George Beck's granddaughter, who actually her father was Nelson Johnston. He was the ambassador to China in the late 1930s when World War II was breaking out there. And so she remembers as a little girl fleeing China, coming to Cody, Wyoming to stay with the Becks, while her father kind of worked out what he could there before he came to Wyoming. But anyway, she was telling us all sorts of stories about her grandfather. And one thing she mentioned is that he had this wonderful puckish sense of humor. Well, the public memory of Beck, no one here ever recalls him having any sense of humor. In all those photos, he looks kind of like a grumpy old man. And so we're kind of puzzled by this. But anyway, she said, well, I'm going to bring out some material. She brought out 4 boxes full of photographs, letters, you name it. And we get to the last box and we're going down there and we actually found the original manuscript, the Beck manuscript. And what had happened, and this is a cautionary tale for those of you in history doing research, the 2 daughters, Beck's 2 daughters, including B.J. Gerber's mom, the granddaughter's mom, decided to clean it up before they deposited it in the archives. So they went through and they edited everything out that they found questionable. And so, for example, when BJ was telling us about her grandfather's wonderful sense of humor, she mentioned she remembered driving around Cody with him in the backseat of his car there, listening to his stories, and there was a big sack of ginger snaps. And so, oh, that's kind of interesting. We get to the original manuscript. There was a line in there where George Beck talks about courting his future wife, Daisy, in the town of Marquette, which is no longer in existence, but he was courting her. And he said in the memoir, he said, I would often go out in my buckboard and I would take Daisy for a ride around the country and always brought a sack of ginger snaps. And she loved ginger snaps. One day I worked up the courage to ask her to marry me, and she said yes. However, I think she may have been saying yes to more ginger snaps. So wonderful story, wonderful story. The copies that were in the archives, they changed buckboard to buggy, and they stripped out all references to the ginger snaps.
Oh.
And so what many historians have looked at Beck's past life and legacy have seen is basically an edited version of what they thought was his original memoir. And so it basically reads, I would take Daisy riding in the country in my buggy. I asked her to marry me and she said yes. Very different connotation of the original there. So, and there's a wonderful story in there too that they stripped out about Buffalo Bill and George Beck going to the Mormon community of Burlington here in the Bighorn Basin and getting into all sorts of trouble. But I am aware of who my audience is, so I'll let you read that on your own.
Oh, nobody get in trouble. Well, that's amazing. That's really fun to hear those stories. And I guess one of the questions that I think we ask is, why is what you're doing, the research that you're involved in and the things you're doing, why is that so meaningful for history, and especially meaningful for you on a personal level? And you kind of touched on the for you piece of it. Mm-hmm. But this is neat stuff. Why? Tell us about that.
Why is history meaningful? And it's painful for me to see how a lot of people across this country just dismiss history. When I was teaching at Northwest College, basically my students fell in one of two groups. They loved history or they hated it. And there was rarely anyone that was in between. And so what I noticed is that those that hated it, usually they were in a classroom where they were told, we're going to memorize all these fun dates. And we're going to learn all the presidents and the years they served in office and the order they served in. And that's what we're going to study here. And you're going to take a bunch of multiple choice tests, and that's great. And you'll learn this and you'll move on. The ones that did love history, I think it stemmed from the fact that they were closely connected to their families and they were able to get that personal insight on history. And it was somewhat useful, but also somewhat harmful. But a lot of my students would also come in and, they had just seen the latest Hollywood blockbuster on some historical event like Pearl Harbor or that god awful film on the Titanic. I'm still in trouble with my wife because I provided commentary through the entire Titanic movie. So, but come on, it took 2 hours before the boat even hit the iceberg. Come on, let's move forward. But anyway, sorry, I got sidetracked there. So, but anyway, for me, I think really, for me, history demonstrates who we are today. And it gives us a good insight as to where we should be heading, what works, what doesn't work. And it really is frustrating for me that people just kind of dismiss history as being either just entertainment, or they look at it as, people using it for political reasons. They present one side as, being the good side and one side as the bad side. And it's understanding who we are, where we came from is so important. And for me, history, the skills that really perfected for me that I think all Americans should really try to perfect is it really caused me to question my own biases. when I was reading resources. And I tell you what, that came up when I'm researching my own family, and I find out that one of them was arrested for violating prohibition here in Cody, Wyoming. So that's something we didn't share around the Thanksgiving table. But anyway, you really got to kind of check your own biases. You got to question everything. You have to listen to other people's arguments. People are always complaining about the revisionist revisionist historians, but all of history is revisionist history. When you sit down and you pitch a book to a publisher, you have to tell them why your biography on Buffalo Bill and Theodore Roosevelt is different from the others. And believe me, when you're doing something with Buffalo Bill and Theodore Roosevelt, you're looking at hundreds and hundreds of other biographies that are out there. So you have to say, what is your interpretation going to be, and how is that different from the others? And I look at the past just the same way I look at our current political situation in the United States. People just kind of shut down. They pick and choose what they want to hear about the past, what they want to hear about the present, about the current political course of action. And those skills that we develop as historians are really so important. And I just wish history was more widespread in the high schools, colleges, more general education requirements. And it really kind of got into those key skills of historians instead of just memorizing all the dates. So I'm sorry, I kind of got on the soapbox there.
No, that's good. That's good. We've got students here that are watching. We're into these historical programs and the research is done. What kind of skills are necessary for you've talked about young historians. What kind of skills would they need to have to see the projects through that you're working with?
Oh, well, in many ways, you need to develop the skills of a detective. And I think that's keeping an open mind as you're going through the archival materials. You're constantly questioning your interpretations, questioning your sources. Because one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at history, in some cases you may have a lot of material to study, but you also have to keep in mind there's a lot of material that is completely gone. It's disappeared. So for example, with Buffalo Bill, you would think that every aspect of Buffalo Bill's life is covered, but actually we have very few business records left from Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And it's hard to determine some of the things that we assert, like equal pay for Lakota performers, women performers, and so on. So you really got to keep an open mind as you're going through this and shaping your interpretation. Communication is really important. You really need to be able to communicate. Be it through writing, speaking, it's very important. And then also in working with the papers of William F. Cody, I've had the good fortune of working with Doug Seafelt, who's now at Ball State University, who works on digital history. And I know there's some people out there that are really into history, but they don't want to teach because they don't like public speaking. And let me tell you, the digital history, it's a very different way of communicating, but you're still communicating. And you really got to kind of be aware of who your audiences are and how to present that material and, engage them. And so they understand where you're coming from. The other skill I'd have to say is is reaching out and collaborating. And I know this has been difficult for some people that have studied history because you kind of get territorial about your subject, and lo and behold, you hear someone else is out there working on a project on the same subject, and you kind of panic and, oh my God, they're going to steal my ideas. Really interacting and communicating with other people, sharing your ideas, presenting your arguments, and then being willing to listen to others counter with their arguments is really important. So even though someone else is working on the same subject as you, it's still worth reaching out to them and discussing what you're doing. And I think in many cases, you'll find out you're looking at things very differently, presenting different interpretations. And like I said, all history is revisionist history. So don't just lock up what you're doing. Be able to go out there, share it, debate it with others, even those in the same field of study and looking at some of the same subjects.
And are these skills something that a student could learn at BYU?
Oh, most definitely. And I know you are. Yeah, definitely. So, I've been very fortunate to meet quite a few BYU students through the papers, William F. Cody. I've seen their work through what they're doing with Frank Christensen and the Charles Redd Center. And yeah, you guys are spot on. I mean, BYU does a really good job. And again, one thing I appreciate about BYU is it's not just classroom. I mean, that's important, sitting in that basic U.S. history survey course and getting the general feel of American history or world history is important. But there at BYU, there's a lot of opportunities for students to get involved in internships, work as graduate assistants. And that's really, really important because like I said before, history is so much more than just learning the dates and the people's names. You really got to put it into practice. And for me, the internships that I did at University of Wyoming were very instructive for me because I was not only able to determine what I wanted to do, but what I really didn't want to do. So for example, after processing a few archival collections, I realized I'm not well suited to be an archivist. I'm not well suited to go into library studies. This just isn't for me. First of all, I'm not that well organized, and secondly, it gets to be a little tedious, and for me it was anyway. But each of us have our unique characteristics, our unique strengths and weaknesses, and so getting hands-on experience is really critical to determining your own self strengths and weaknesses and deciding what you really are going to be good at in your future.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy, tell us what levels of expertise would a student need to to do some of the jobs that you again, you mentioned these young historians. What levels of expertise are we looking at?
And that's the great thing about history careers is they're so varied. And I mean, with a bachelor's, or in some cases, maybe even an associate's degree, there's still positions out there. So for example, I know here in Wyoming at a lot of our local museums, it's people that have undergraduate degrees in history, or in some cases other fields, but they just love the past. They're passionate about history, and they're working in these small museums, and they're doing a really good job. Of course, with teaching, there's all sorts of opportunities there. You can get a bachelor's degree in history and then get a secondary ed and education and teaching the high school level. Master's degree, that opens up community colleges, teaching there. It opens up positions in some of the archives, some of the larger museums. So for example, an assistant curator here at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, it usually is required that you have a master's degree to do this position. And I think when you start getting into the graduate degrees, that's really demonstrating that you have the capability to take a research project and do something with it. Present it as a historical article, a presentation, or a dissertation, so on. And then of course the PhD level, and actually for PhD, I'm a latecomer to PhD work. I just completed my PhD a few years ago at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. And the reason why I did that is because when I became the managing editor of the papers, my boss said, we would really like you to get the PhD, because they thought that, and it was rightly so, it would enhance what we're doing with the papers of William F. Cody. And he was right, because one of the problems we've had with the papers of William H. Cody is when we meet with people like, the leaders of the papers of George Washington, John Adams, James Madison, they, Buffalo who? Buffalo Bill? Was that the guy shot in Deadwood? Did he actually know how to write? So we had to up our game a little. But anyway, and the other thing too is that teaching is not necessarily a career you need to look in. There's a lot of archival positions. different levels there that require different degrees. Mention the museum work, but there's also historical sites, National Park Service. A lot of the interpreters have history degrees, even attorneys. Sometimes this pains me to say this, but yeah, history is good training for being an attorney because it really teaches you to analyze resources, documents, evidence, and present a coherent argument. So there's a lot of different careers out there at different levels. For me, I'd have to say the number one thing you must have if you're going to go into a career, and then this is really for any career, is you need to be passionate about your subject. Because I'm going to tell you right now, no matter what job you're performing, and it could be your absolute dream job, there's going to be some days that you're just ready to pull your hair out. In fact, you can see the gray here, and this has come from my number of dream jobs that I've had, that and children. But anyway, any job you have is going to have its high moments and its low points. And for me, it's always been the passion for history that keeps me going forward. So, I feel very passionate about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And for me, I want to make history accessible to as many people as possible. And that's what keeps me going. That's what keeps me going. So I think of that some days when I'm banging my head against the wall. So, and then usually you kind of wait it out, and a few days later, or even the next day, oh, this was a great day. So you're doing things like when I was curator, I'll never forget the moment where I had in this hand, I had Buffalo Bill's Winchester. In this hand, I had Annie Oakley's Winchester, and I was moving them from one case to another, wearing gloves, of course. But I tell you what, I said, this is a pretty cool job. So I'm glad I stayed here. I'm glad I stopped banging my head and kept going with it.
So when you move those Winchesters, were you wearing rawhide gloves with fringes, or were you wearing cotton gloves?
No, it was, at the time it was cotton gloves. We now have the rubber gloves that we're wearing. That's another side of history too. If you ever get a chance, it really fascinates me is the history preservation. We have a conservator here on staff, and for me and a lot of students that I was advising at Northwest, most people who want to major in history hate math and they hate science. And so they want to go into history, but I'm telling you what, if you have a liking of history and math or history and science, that opens up a whole nother realm of careers that are really quite fascinating, managing sites, historic preservation, conservation, there's a whole nother field there as well.
So within the history realm,
yeah,
adding those extra disciplines really open up more doors for you.
It does. It really does. Yeah. No. And, for me, it really was helpful. I was just one class short of minoring in English. But just history, when you're studying history, you're blending so many different fields of study. History is really the only profession where if you take on a topic, you need to be kind of familiar with a lot of different fields of studies. So for example, in my early research at University of Wyoming, I was looking at my great grandfather, who was the hunting guide for Roosevelt, and he was also basically a predator control agent. And predator control is not that popular amongst a lot of people on university campuses. So I kind of had to get in and open my mind and listen to current studies of predator control. I actually enrolled in a wildlife management class, and this is a person who, I must confess, confession is good for the soul. This is a person who got a dog from his parents because he managed to pull straight C's in middle school. And the toughest C I pulled was that one in my biology class. But anyway, looking at that particular history subject, though, I said, yeah, maybe I got to go back and knuckle down and learn a little bit about wildlife management, which meant understanding a little bit more about those scientific principles they were trying to teach me back in middle school and high school.
Well, this has been fantastic. You really appreciate. Is there something that we should be asking you about how what would be important for the students to know before we go to our Q&A?
I said passion. If you're passionate about your subject, that really takes you a long way. And then I just want to reemphasize that BYU students, you have a lot of resources there. A lot of great faculty members, professional staff members that are just going above and beyond to help you in your careers. So you need to take the steps to reach out to them. Ask questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. And I'm very sincere about that. If you were just have a curiosity about something, there's a lot of people there at BYU that will sit down with you and talk with you. And, and again, you can decide whether or not that's the best course of action for your future academic and professional career. But anyway, BYU is a great place. Frank gave me the tour there a few years ago, and I was really impressed. First of all, I was surprised you actually let me on campus, but anyway, was impressed with your facilities there. So,
well, you're welcome anytime. I think after this, you'll probably get a steady stream of students coming up to see you.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, please do. Let us know when you're coming up here. So, because I think I gave you my contact information, Arnie. If you want to share that with any of your students, please do so.
I'll freely administer that stuff.
Oh, so good.
That's good. Well, we have some questions. Maria, let me get you on this little thing here, and if you could ask a question, this would be you have a really good question. So Maria, I think you have the ability to talk, do you?
Oh, there she is.
That's better. I was talking with my computer muted.
What's your question, Maria?
Well, I was just wondering when you were talking about historical preservation a few seconds ago, about what kind of interesting classes would go well with that, and also like what experiences do you have with historical preservation? My apartment has very bad internet, so if I cut out, I might turn off my video again.
Okay. No, we can see you and hear you fine now. Yeah, very limited experience with historic preservation. Most of my contribution to historical preservation projects has been doing some of the research in the archives, coming up with the historical related material. So for example, quite a few years ago, there's an old site here known as Beartooth Stockade, and no one really knew who built it or why they built it, but it's a fairly substantial stockade that was built up on top of the Beartooth Plateau. And so I collaborated with a group of archaeologists who were studying it and mapping the site and determining if it's something that should be preserved. And so I collaborated with them. It was really fascinating to watch them because through the tree ring data, they were collecting tree ring samples through the logs there. They were able to find a specific date on the structure, which was really great. They found out it was 1862, I believe, 1863, which is really quite amazing. A log structure would, still remain from that time period. So I worked with them a little bit. Some of my students worked at the Bighorn Canyon Recreational Area, which is just north of where Arnie's mother's family resided there in Lovell. But anyway, there's a site there called, well, it was actually a ranch, the Lockhart Ranch. It was ran by Carolyn Lockhart, who was a early day author in Cody, Wyoming, who made everyone angry because she based all her fictional characters on real residents of the town. And I think she set up this ranch to get away from everybody. But anyway, one of my students, it was kind of funny because he was a hunting guide. spent a lot of time outdoors. Of course, had that standard anti-federal perspective that a lot of Westerners had. And he started working on preserving some of the cabins there at the Lockhart Ranch. And they made him get a Ranger's uniform. And so he had a Ranger's outfit on, and he said it took a while before he could feel comfortable wearing the Ranger green, but he made it through, did a good job. So there's various jobs out there. Again, really it's having that scientific knowledge if you wanted to get in and do the actual work on the site. Understanding chemistry, and we work with our conservator here on a regular basis. When something happens with one of our objects, she needs to look at a little bit of mold growing on something, or getting the tarnish off of the silver saddle, and do it in a way that it's not going to actually damage the object. Because we do have a mission not only to interpret our objects, get them out and put them on display, but also to preserve them for as long as we possibly can for future generations. So, but and again, I would just start looking out on websites. All of these professions have historical society, or have their own professional societies, and usually they list job bases, and it's always fun to go through and kind of look at the different jobs available. And just kind of see what pay grade is, what kind of requirements they need, and so on. So the wanted ads are pretty important. And if you can get into these societies, usually they open up their wanted ads to the general public.
Oh, thank you.
You bet. Good luck.
I'll need it.
Question that's come to me here, Jeremy, is we understand why it's so important for history, but what's so meaningful about Bill Cody and the stuff that you're working on? What, that's a cool subject. What meaning does that have for us?
Yeah. It's been very interesting. It is a cool subject. And, I came at it as a very different perspective. So I grew up in this area, and I remember as a small boy going to the Buffalo Bill Center of the West and going through the Buffalo Bill Museum. And I always saw Buffalo Bill as the town founder, the founder of Cody. And he kind of had this show thing going on and was well known, but he was our town founder. And when you get out of your own comfort zone, your own town, and go to different places, you're exposed to many different opinions. And believe, Cody, he is really a polarizing figure. And a lot of that is due to, cultural changes through the decades. I mentioned entertainment is a very powerful force in shaping interpretations of history. So a lot of people will ask me questions based on seeing the movie Buffalo Bill and the Indians, starring Paul Newman as Buffalo Bill. So basically, he's been blamed for killing off all the buffalo. He's been blamed for exploiting American Indians in his show. He's been blamed for killing countless number of Indians on the plains. I mean, basically, he's become kind of the symbolic scout that won the West for the whites at the expense of the settlers that were here before, the American Indian settlers. What's fascinating about Cody, though, is that he was so popular. And just to put this in perspective, back in the 1970s, Don Russell completed a study of Wild West shows. So this is back in the 70s, before we had this thing called the internet or Google. And he was able to uncover at least 116 different Wild West shows. Now, if I was to ask the audience to name a Wild West show besides Buffalo Bill's Wild West, I have a feeling that most of you would not have an answer. Some of you may mention Pawnee Bill because you saw the musical Annie Get Your Gun. But for the most part, all of these other Wild West shows are forgotten. And really, Buffalo Bill's Wild West, it creates all these iconic images we have of the American West based on episodes that rarely occurred in the historical reality. So for example, the attack of the Deadwood Stagecoach. Now, when you saw the Wild West, here comes the Deadwood Stagecoach. It's chased by the Lakota performers. Lo and behold, just about the time everyone's going to be wiped out, here comes Buffalo Bill with not the cavalry, the cowboys. So if you played Cowboys versus Indians as a kid, you can thank Buffalo Bill. But anyway, that happened so rarely in the American West because stagecoach companies, they were businesses. They realized the last thing we want to do is run our stagecoaches through hostile territory. Let's move the routes to get away from the problem. So yeah, it happened occasionally, but it wasn't a daily occurrence. Now think about this. How many of you watched a Western film where have you seen the Deadwood Stagecoach being attacked? So, I mean, it could be a film that was produced just a few years ago, and that's kind of the standard trope that gets thrown out there. Our images of Custer's Last Stand. I mentioned the Cowboys versus Indians. Pony Express. Pony Express was a failed business, but every night in the Wild West, you would see the Pony Express rider go around. And I think every Western film, there's some kind of legal requirement. You have to have a Pony Express rider in there now, even though the real business lasted for just, a year and a half. So he really set a lot of our popular perceptions of the American West. The other thing that's really surprising about Buffalo Bill that a lot of people don't know about, and it's really eye-opening, is he was actually an advocate for preventing hunting in Yellowstone National Park, for conserving wildlife in Wyoming. He formed a club to make sure settlers were adhering to game laws so that today you would still see elk, deer, antelope. I came across an article one time, the Cody Enterprise, no one knew what these strange creatures were south of town. This was back in the early 1900s, and it turned out to be antelope. And they were shocked. They hadn't seen antelope. Now you see antelope everywhere up here. So really instrumental in conservation and bison conservation. I mean, he was really quite an advocate for bison conservation. He introduced a lot of people for the first time to where they could actually see a bison, a real bison. And then, regarding the American Indians, he really was quite an advocate later on for American Indians. In his last autobiography, he concludes it by basically saying, everyone who lives in the United States is living on lands that were the American Indians' heritage. This was their land to inherit. We need to make sure, in basically recognizing their rights, that they are treated well. Their political rights are protected. They're not taken advantage of. And so he was really quite a vocal advocate for American Indian people.
That's great.
So, and again, it's kind of a complex story, which I love because it really demonstrates relevancy of history. You can't take a figure like Buffalo Bill and put him in the column of hero, villain.
Yeah.
A lot of the issues that we see on the silver screen were a lot more complex, a lot more nuances were taking place here in the American West. And so I think he's a really good vehicle in kind of helping us not only understand him, but and his legacy, but also the land that we live in.
Yeah, that's great. We're just about out of time. Have a couple more questions though. Julianne, would you like to take just a couple minutes and ask Jeremy your question?
Yeah, I was wondering, what made you want to study in Scotland, and how did you make decisions for your graduate degrees and where to study?
Well, yeah, when people hear I received my PhD from Scotland, they're a little surprised. It was a practical reason for me. I was told I needed to complete my PhD. At the time, I still am married, 3 children. I realized, going to a campus and establishing residency is going to be very difficult. And then on top of that, I was still working here at the center. So in Britain, the British model, basically when you're working on your PhD, they consider your master's degree to cover all your coursework. So as a PhD candidate, I only focused on completing my PhD dissertation, which worked out really well for me because I was here at the center studying Buffalo Bill, working on Theodore Roosevelt. And so it was kind of a natural fit that I could take what I was doing with my dissertation and incorporate it here. So that worked out really well. The surprise for me was I thought, oh, this will be fun. The Wyoming kid is going to go to Scotland, and I'll have fun telling people I'm from Wyoming, and they'll say, oh, where's Wyoming located? And actually, I was surprised as I got in there and everyone said, oh, Wyoming. Yeah, that's Buffalo Bill country. Oh, yeah, and Yellowstone. I know of Wyoming. Unfortunately, a lot of them had not traveled here because they still, thanks to Buffalo Bill, still think we use stagecoaches to get around, and we still have to worry about Indian attacks. I disavowed them of that. But what really cemented it for me was there in Scotland, Glasgow, Scotland, in one of their suburbs, Johnston, there's actually a statue of Buffalo Bill Cody, where he performed with Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And so it was an eye-opening experience for me to see the European perspective of the Wild West. And one thing that spun out of that, working with other scholars, and they've noticed the same thing, is all these different European countries, Buffalo Bill really knew his audiences, and he would change the Wild West performances to kind of create a cultural bond. So using the story of the West, but something they could identify with. So for example, when he was in Spain, one of his performances was going around and showing how he killed buffalo using blanks in his rifle. And all these Spaniards were sitting in the stadium going, when is he actually going to get off the horse and kill these animals? Because they're accustomed to bullfighting. You know, some guy riding around shooting blanks at animals is just weird. So he changed it up. He said, okay, we're going to start having bucking bronco contests. So you guys get out there. I want the vaqueros, the cowboys, the Lakota. You guys go out there and you do the best to hurt yourself, and they'll love it. And they did love it because it was something that they could identify with. They say, okay, yeah, I can see the Westerners are kind of like us. They like to take on these real big animals and get hurt, just like our bullfighters. So it's kind of fascinating. We see that all throughout Europe, him changing up the show just to kind of create these bonds. And I'll never forget, you know, this, the Western culture is well embedded in Europe. First time I was there, they picked me up, and the person that picked me up was listening to Garth Brooks. Not bagpipes, Garth Brooks.
How fun. Well, one more question. Amy Rich has a question for you. Amy?
Hi, yeah. So my question, hi. I just wondered, how did you decide to pursue history as your career rather than just teaching history in like a secondary education kind of place?
You know, I always had that deep passion for history, and I knew I wanted to do something with it. I didn't know exactly what that would be, how that would turn out. As I noted, my family thought I was crazy because they thought, we're going to have to take care of him for forever now because he's not going to get a job. But, you know, the more I looked into it, there was just so many different career paths that opened up with history. And, you know, I could have gone in and been an attorney. I could have gone into historical preservation, education, public history, writing, you name it. And so for me, the big question wasn't whether or not I should go into history. It was, what do I want to do with history? And that's where the internships and the fellowships and working in archival repositories, museums really paid off, just so I could get my feet wet in all these different careers and see where I fit.
Well, this has been great today, Jeremy. Thank you. It's nice to hear that you heard history calling, and we see where it took you. And
well, thank you, Arnie, and thanks to everyone who joined us today. And I extend the welcome. Please come up and visit us at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. So when we get back to the new normal or the new abnormal, hopefully you guys can take a field trip up here, load up the buses, bring as many students as you can.
love to. That would be great. Jeremy, thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Folks that came, thanks for being, and we'll see you next month.